Baptism and temptation. This is where we are introduced to John as an adult. And John had probably served as a priest until he was 30 years old. His father was a priest, and it would be assumed that John would be a priest. It would be expected of him. And more than likely, that's what happened. This actually helped him to be known. He was not a stranger. People knew who he was, and so he probably served as a priest until the Spirit of God led him out into the wilderness to be a prophet. Now, you have to remember, the people hadn't had a prophet for over 400 years. In a sense, they were ready for one. They wanted to hear from God. And so he comes on the scene. Now, his entire ministry probably didn't last longer than 2 years, if even that. And yet, what he accomplished in that 2 years, people, many, many years later were still considering themselves to be disciples of John. His job was to be a forerunner. And the forerunner, he accomplished this by doing two things. First of all, simply by pointing and saying, that is Christ right there. That is the Messiah. To identify the Messiah. But in addition to that, John's job as a forerunner was to gather large crowds and teach them. Crowds that eventually would come to Christ. And John did his job and did it in less than 2 years. Interesting that many people came to John to hear him preach. The two most interesting were the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees were the more conservative group. They had a more strict lifestyle. They created sub-laws. It was what I call a sub-law. And what I mean for that is that they would have a way that they wanted to obey the law of God. So they created these laws on themselves to help them do that. That's not an unusual thing to do. As a Christian, I will want to follow God and I will want to follow Him in a particular way. So I will set up a certain standard for myself that helps me to fulfill that. Now, if I pass that on to my children, and if they do that, and then if they teach their children to do it, eventually there comes a generation that has these sub-laws, these standards, and they will fulfill those standards thinking this is how I can be true to God, and they don't really know why the standard's there. They think the standard itself is the way to please God. And that's what the Pharisees were doing. They set up many, many, many sub-laws to help them follow God. It was a good thing. It was a right thing to do. But this got taught and passed down to the next generation, who then passed it down to the next generation. And by the time we come to the time of Jesus, they were holding to these laws as if they were the laws of God, and they weren't. So, yet these people, these Pharisees, were people who wanted and sought after God. They wanted to obey God. And Jesus honors them for that. Also, the Pharisees, unlike the Sadducees, come from all walks of life. They actually show us many different types of people who come and become Pharisees. We see Jesus fussing at the Pharisees a lot. And you may think that, well, because Jesus is fussing at them, that He doesn't like them, that He doesn't love them. And it's just the opposite. He's fussing at them because He does love them. In the first century, many of them came to Christ. Jesus knew this. He knew that these Pharisees, He was teaching them and preparing them for their walk with Christ. Paul was a Pharisee. And down through the generations, there's many of us who are basically Pharisees who have come to Christ. And we need to listen to the fussing that Jesus has towards us. Now, the other group was the Sadducees. They were the more liberal group. They did not come from all walks of life. They were actually from the priestly nobility. They profited from the temple, and they profit from the business. Every time Jesus cleansed the temple, and we are recorded 2 of those times, he was actually going after the Sadducees there. Now, the Sadducees had more of a political agenda. A lot of things they didn't believe. They only held to the first 5 books of Moses. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection, but the Sadducees didn't. And so this was a group that Jesus really didn't have a lot of time for. It says that after John and Jesus was baptized, the Spirit of God took him into the wilderness to be tempted, and he fasted for 40 days. Now you have to understand, when it says he was hungry, that's a different hunger than you and I experience after missing a meal. We are hungry in the stomach for 3 days. After 3 days, our stomach hunger stops, and we literally start feeding off of the entire body. And we can go for about 40 days on this, eating on basically the fat of the land. But after we run out of that, which is about 40 days, we're hungry from every part of our body, every place that stores fat. That's where we're hungry. And when it says Jesus was hungry, this is when people would kill their own children and eat them. This is a hunger that drives people mad. So the temptation, the first one was to cause those stones to become bread. Jesus looked at those stones. They actually kind of look like bread, by the way. He could imagine doing that. Now we see the temptation, there's 3 of them. The causing the stones to become bread, that was to get a quick fix, to fix a problem. You can do it. You have a need? Let's just fix it right here. When he took him up on top of the temple and to cast himself down, that was to prove who he was. When he went up to a high mountain and saw all of the kingdoms of the earth, and I think that was Mount Hermon, as they say there, that was to get a shortcut. I see myself tempted in these 3 ways. I often want God to give me a quick fix to a problem. Often my prayers are just to fix something and do it fast. And Jesus said there's more important things than your temporary problem. Then also there's times when I want God to assure me that He's with me. The casting the self off. Sometimes I will put God to the test by saying, now I'll do this thing and God's going to come and prove Himself. No, God's not necessarily really into that. There's other times I just want a shortcut. I want to have success and I want it quickly. I want God to give me a quick success. Let's learn from the temptations of Jesus. He's not after giving us a quick fix. He's not after proving Himself to us. And He's not after giving us a shortcut to success. Come back next week and we continue on with more insights on the story of the week. We'll see you next week.